Faye, thank you for joining me today in this conversation. I just started your book, so I'm in the middle of it, waiting to find out how it turns out. And my question is, what gave you the idea to write about this? Was it a personal concern? Was it a cultural concern for the Asian American church? What gave you that impetus?
So I wrote Peace Over Perfection out of a personal struggle of my own with perfectionism, specifically in the area of spirituality. So perfectionism in my walk with God that manifested in anxiety, guilt, kind of feeling like I would never be good enough before God in my efforts to serve Him, in my efforts to follow Him. And I found that the resources out there for those who are struggling with it are pretty sparse. Sometimes people address perfectionism spiritually with either kind of saying, well, if you believe the gospel, then you wouldn't care because you know you're loved, and so then why do you still struggle? Or people would say, on the other hand, you just got to lower your standards, don't pursue God as much. So it was out of a personal struggle that I realized other people had to, and yeah, that's why I wrote it.
Okay, no, that's great. That's great. And as a pastor, I'm always trying to get people to understand justification, righteousness, the finished work of Christ. How does the gospel fit in with what you're trying to get across in the book?
So I think two ways in which the gospel addresses the way that we deal with performance. I mean, definitely, fundamentally, right, there is justification because we know that we're forgiven by God through Christ, that we stand righteous before Him. But not only are we righteous before Him, it also means that we are welcomed into His presence and we are at peace with God. Sometimes I think in our maybe in our theology and in the way we understand justification as kind of like a courtroom image, like there's a judge and he says you're innocent, which is incredible, amazing, right? The like eternal judge of the universe, says you're free to go even though you were a sinner, right, because of His Son. But from that point, what does our relationship with God look like, right? There's an issue.
Trying to rest in that, trying to receive that.
Or even just like, you don't necessarily, just because you're free to go and you're declared innocent doesn't mean you want a relationship with your judge, right? And so what does that mean that we're justified? We actually now have a relationship with God that where we're at peace with Him and He is our Father. So I think the way that it changes the way we think about how we serve God or walk with God is that now we can serve out of a place of knowing His pleasure and in knowing who He is as He deals with us. But I have a question for you. Do you feel like as you serve in your church that you have seen that ever in your people? Kind of this striving, not just to perform or like in a worldly way, but in a spiritual way.
And I see it more on the despair side than the pride side. I see it in people, particularly Asian Americans, who pursue excellence but don't want to put themselves out there. They don't want to serve. They don't want to take chances or risks unless they can do it perfectly or with almost excellence. And so I find myself as a pastor pushing them forward to serve and to disciple and to go plant churches and go on missions in the sense that you don't have to be perfect. It's okay to fail. It's okay to struggle. And God has already done the bulk of the work. He's gotten you to the point where you are His child, and whatever you do is added to that.
So what specifically kind of do you say to someone who's like, I do want to serve God, but like I know that I'm forgiven, but I just don't want to fail Him because I love Him, but I know His standards are really high. I feel like especially in Asian context, there is that kind of sense of we know our parents love us, but also part of that love is shown in correction, but mostly maybe for many of our families, at least the families that I serve, it's mostly correction. I love you, so that's why I have to tell you what you're doing wrong. But not necessarily like I love you, so I'm like encouraging you.
Part of it starts with just having a supportive environment, encouraging people to try new things, We have a culture where it's okay to fail, and it's okay to try out what God is giving you the opportunity to do. And so we have that kind of culture established. But I want people in my church to be able to see, Philippians 2, like to work out their own salvation with fear and trembling. There is fear there. There is trembling there. But to know that God is the one who undergirds that work.
Yeah.
And He is the one that kind of pushes them forward.
Yeah.
And we hear all the time about God's grace is sufficient and His power is made perfect in weakness. And we need to be able to live that out and not just know it intellectually. And that's where I think the divide is for our people.
I really love, I think, what you said about just that God is undergirding, that He is pushing that work forward. Because I think sometimes our performance-drivenness and our fear of failure is because we don't know who we are in Christ. Mm-hmm. But sometimes I think it's because we do, and we love Him and we love His people, and we don't want to hurt them by failing.
Yes.
I think in communal cultures especially, there's that sense of everything that you do is not just about you.
Right.
Like what you do is also like, how is this person going to feel if I say this, and what's going to happen? And it's just this awareness that what we do affects other people, and that can make us feel really afraid to serve, as like ministry leaders, or even just as Christians. Like, what if I don't say the right thing, or I mess up and I misrepresent Christ, and so maybe I just shouldn't be a leader because I still struggle with sin, and I'm not perfect yet, because it would hurt other people.
Right.
But I think there is freedom as like a ministry leader, but even just as a Christian who wants to love people, and knowing that it's like God is the one who is, you are His workmanship. He is the one who's prepared good works for you. He is sovereign and He is gracious, and so you can labor in freedom. Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. There's a sense in which we don't want to let people down.
Yeah.
We don't want to hurt people. I think for me and for a lot of the people that I work with, we're always checking ourselves to see how people are responding, to how people are thinking of us. And there's always that need to kind of get that reflection point.
Yeah.
And like Psalm 46:10 it says, "Be still and know that I am God." And it kind of brings us back to center focus. And so to stop striving, to stop trying so hard, and just to say, okay, let me begin again with just knowing who I am in God, and beginning there. How is that for you as a pastor's wife? I'm a pastor. Yeah. We both, I think, serve in somewhat smaller churches. Do you ever feel like when people come to your church, you kind of have to put your best face out there, your best foot forward, and they need to see your church as not as it isn't, but as its best performance kind of way?
Yeah, that's a good question. So performance, not just in terms of like individually,
not just
but
individually,
as our
church.
As our church.
Yeah.
I think that there definitely is a desire, right, for us to show our best. Right, and sometimes we might say like, oh, it's excellence, or it's because but part of it's like
bring people in.
But part of it's like, everybody's late, and then this newcomer is like looking around, and there's like 5-10 people here or something like that, and then it's like, this looks really bad, right, for our church. But I think, thankfully, like over the years, there's just been a different culture shift, maybe from what it was before, as we have learned together. To walk even in our brokenness, to walk in our imperfections, to lift up Jesus, and so it's always helpful for me to remember. And this is where I think the pastor's wife part comes in, because I did feel called to ministry and desired it, even before I married my husband. But sometimes I'm like, oh wow, the church really is a hospital, right? Like it's not a museum of like perfect people. It's like a hospital where Jesus says, I didn't come for the healthy people. Like I came for the sick, right? And I didn't come for the righteous. I came for the sinners, which on paper is like, yes, like, and for individually it feels like, that is great. But then when you're like, what did I sign up for?
Right.
Like,
in reality, it's hard.
You're like, whoa, this is, but because through that, the point is that Jesus is the healer, right? That Jesus is the rescuer, that Jesus is, What about you as a pastor? Is there that desire sometimes to perform?
Yeah, I think part of it is always feeling like I'm trying to lead my flock. I'm trying to shepherd them to be a certain type of church in the community and to minister to people. And even the good things, like how do we minister to the helpless and the hurting? How do we bring lost people to Christ? How do we disciple the younger generation? Even those things can become performative when it becomes my identity as a pastor, especially as a solo pastor, trying to say, okay, it's all on me, and forgetting that this is about Christ, this is about pointing people to Him. And so that's the struggle that I am constantly battling with as a pastor. Yeah,
and you talked about Psalm 46, right? Be still and know that I am God. And I remember years ago someone pointing out, like, the next verse is like, I will be exalted in the nations, I will be exalted in all the earth, right? And so, like, as a minister, as some people who desire God's kingdom to come, like, there is this, we know that He's God, and we can be still because God is exalting His own name. And so I think that takes away some of that burden off of ourselves too, whether it be in our churches as ministry leaders, or even just as, like, Christians who desire His kingdom to come in our schools, or with our friends, or in our families, that, like, He is exalting His name, and we walk with Him in it. And so there's this stillness that comes, not because we're like, well, whatever happens. It's not that. It's like God is working even when we are sleeping, even when we are failing, even when our church isn't exactly what it's supposed to be, or we falter with our words with our family. We're not the witness that we want to be. He is exalting Himself, and so there is a stillness and a peace that can come because we can trust Him.
Okay. And the coming glory, the future glory, thinking about Christ's return, and there will be perfection at some point, right? How do we kind of think in those terms, and with that in view, as it affects how we live today? I mean, how does that affect our striving today for Christ, but with a mindset that we're not there yet, we're not perfect at this moment, but we will at one point be glorified? How does that help us to live today?
Yeah, so 1 John 3:2, it talks about how, beloved, we're children of God. We will be made like Him when He comes back, because we will see Him as He is. And so I think there's this, there's first of all an acknowledgement that we aren't yet what we will be. And so that takes some of the expectations, right? God He calls us to holiness, but He also taught us to pray for forgiveness, because He knows that we're not there yet, right? And so there's this acknowledgement that, hey, we're not there yet, and God doesn't expect us to be there overnight, right? But there is that hope of that desire that we have for perfection, for holiness and righteousness. We don't have to feel bad for it. That it's like, it's a holy desire, and it makes us hope not in our own efforts
that's
to
how
achieve
it's supposed to be. That's what God is turning us toward. Okay,
and it's also what's promised, right? Like it'll be promised from not by our own power, but when Christ returns, and He will transform us in twinkling of an eye into glory.
Oh, that's great. And that keeps us from just saying, okay, well, I'll be perfect one day, I don't have to try. But also gives us the promise, the assurance, and the hope that's needed.
How do you think it affects, for you in your life, even in ministry, to know that coming glory?
I think personally and pastorally, there's a lot of failure. and part of it is not just other people looking at me, but just me being so hard and critical on myself, and I could have done this better, or I could have said this better, or that person just left the church, and there's a constant critique of my own soul. And being able to come before the Lord and say, I'm trying, I'm growing. You have set apart these good works for me that have been there before the beginning of time. And so realizing that, yes, I'm trying as hard, I'm working hard, I'm pursuing excellence as a pastor or as a person, but also recognizing that all of that is, again, undergirded by God. And if he wants it to happen, it'll happen. If he doesn't want it to happen, he'll hold back from that. And so realizing it's in his purposes.
And I think just even in that, like, you know, not only is he in control, but the scriptures tell us that as a father has compassion on us, like he knows that we're dust.
Yeah.
And so there's this great quote by Tozer who says, you know, God is far more easily pleased than we think, you know. And so it's like, not only is he like, he's not just like,
he's smiling
well,
on
you
us.
messed up, but I'll take care of it. It's fine.
Right.
Fine, just go do your thing, you know, like, just go, I'll take care of it, you know. But he's like, yeah, you know, there's forgiveness, there's grace for when we mess up, but also he's like, I see your efforts. Like, I see that you want to please me. I see that you are trying to let people the best you can.
Like a little child that's doing their best to please their father, but
right? And that he receives that with joy and delight.
And it allows us to rest. It allows us to take Sabbath. It allows us to not always be pushing all the time. And that's a joy. That's a comfort, and that helps us to keep on going when it's a marathon, not a sprint.
A marathon, not a sprint. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Well, Faye, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. It's been a pleasure. I'm glad to have the chance to talk with you.
Thanks. Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me too.